Welcome to Healthcare Simplified, a podcast from Deliver Health. Nothing's inherently simple about healthcare. That's why on Healthcare Simplified, we explore with today's top health leaders how to maximize ROI, staff satisfaction, and public health outcomes by building greater efficiencies into the healthcare connections that matter most between clinicians and technology, providers and patients, and people and their health. I'm your host, Mitch Holdwick. Let's put simplicity to work together. We are here from Shishmid, so thanks so much for tuning in. The name of the podcast is Healthcare Simplified, so I couldn't think of a better guest to bring on than Sondra Brown. Sondra is the founder and leader of MDRG, Marketing Dynamics Research Group. So Sondra, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mitch.
Good to have you here. Maybe a good place to start for our listeners that don't know you, would love to learn a little bit more about you and where you work and what you do.
Definitely. So I am, as you mentioned, the president and founder of MDRG, and we are a consumer insights and market research firm. We have worked in the healthcare space for a very long time, but we also work across other industries that are really playing into helping us think about how to bring healthcare along in a more forward consumer-centric fashion. So industries like CPG and retail and technology that have really been focused on the consumer and digital solutions for a long time.
Sure. So it's, I'd imagine, a lot of disruptors in the industry that really help kind of shape your positioning and approach.
That's right.
Yeah, that's very cool. Admittedly, I wasn't able to attend your session, but I'm so interested in the topic, and I want to touch on that a little bit as we get into today's episode. And a reminder for our listeners that Shishmid, depending on when you're listening to this, all these sessions will be on demand. So I highly encourage you to check out Sondra's session. And when I tell you the title, I know you're going to be intrigued. It was, forget about the metaverse. This is the next big opportunity for healthcare. So without giving away too much, because I think that's such a good hook, I want our listeners to go and actually listen to it. But tell me what that was about. Give us some background on today's session.
Sure. So for those of you who've been following the metaverse, Web3, it is the culmination of the blending of the digital and the physical experience. And there are a lot of behemoth brands out there that are playing in this space right now. I mean, some of those that you can think about that we're all familiar with are Nike Land and Roblox, and Chipotle had their burrito builder also in Roblox. But interestingly, you also have CVS Health, who in February of this year, February of 2022, filed a trademark patent to put their virtual stores in the metaverse and to allow them to prescribe non-emergent care like wellness and nutritional counseling and counseling. And so that being sort of the next big place to play. However, in healthcare, particularly on the provider side, we really haven't even fully mastered the digital experience yet. Yeah. So, talking about this landscape of the metaverse, but realizing that we have got to take a step back before we start thinking about what do the next 5 years look like.
Sure.
Thinking about what does it look like for us to really master a digital experience.
Yeah. Wow, my head hurts just thinking about that world. I don't even know if I can make sense of that, but it certainly kind of forces us to think proactively. But to your point, there's still so much opportunity for us to improve the experience now. When you talk about some of the operational and industry challenges that are contending, so what are some of those challenges that you see?
The meat of the presentation kind of spoke to some of that. This was a presentation that I conducted in concert with Jennifer Bollinger, who is the Chief Consumer Officer at Ochsner Health.
Nice.
And what MDRG did was to conduct a healthcare experience study over the summer it was 60-minute interviews with 10 very leading progressive health systems and 10 very progressive health disruptors in the space to try to understand what are they doing that other systems can learn from,
Sure.
and what are disruptors getting right that we need to learn from. And, there were kind of three big findings. One is, how are they really ensuring that customer experience is prioritized within their organizations and making sure that all of their organizational priorities are aligned with those CX priorities. They're also, voice of the consumer is so ingrained into their DNA. So many of those disruptors started with a problem, a challenge that their founder or someone they love experienced. And their mission was to solve for that problem. So this idea of voice of the consumer being front and center. And then the third thing that was really interesting about this study that I think we can all learn from is they are very focused on forward-thinking metrics like engagement. Because if people aren't engaged, they're not going to use their technology or their service, and then they're not going to get paid. So they're hyper-focused on not just adoption, but engagement. And I think those are all things that we haven't necessarily done a great job at in healthcare.
Interesting. To your point, when I hear you're saying it's activation plus engagement. So what are some examples of engagement? Like how you kind of differentiate between those two?
Well, activation would simply mean I signed up. Engagement would mean I stay engaged with the solution, and it ultimately leads to the outcome. So I'll take one. We did not interview them, but Noom is the very popular weight loss digital solution. For any of you who have ever interacted with that platform, there are daily activities that they want you to engage with. And then there's daily learnings. They send you articles, and they have a whole pathway through this educational component, but daily check-ins, meal prep, recipes. There's a community to interact with. And then if you take a day off or a break from it, there's, I'm sure, a chat bot, but we'll reach out to you and say, hey, we noticed you haven't done X, Y, or Z. So they're tracking that engagement and then ultimately looking at the outcomes.
Interesting. It's kind of counterintuitive, at least operationally within healthcare, where, we know that it's a commodity. You don't need it until you need it, but how do we challenge ourselves to really engage with our patients and give them a reason to kind of interact in between the encounters? That seems to me kind of like another way of defining engagement.
That's right. And I do think there's a shift in healthcare to more of a focus on personal empowerment and also wellness. And there's an understanding that my wellness is going to ultimately have some impact on health outcomes. And so getting patients engaged is going to be really critical to those outcomes. I think that one of the things we're seeing, and we saw in this research, but I'm also seeing in all the other work that we're doing, is this shift from patient to consumer. Because if you think about this notion of patient, the care is the beginning and the end of that experience. So you're a patient when care begins and care ends. However, you're a healthcare consumer in a much more cohesive, longer journey. And while healthcare systems have traditionally thought about, that patient experience in a silo, consumers don't think of it in a silo. Their experiences in one realm inform their ratings and evaluation of all aspects of their interaction with your brand or your organization. So one could then assume that their experience, scheduling an appointment, if you will, is as important as what happens in the physician's office. And I'm not suggesting that outcomes are not important. They are very important. If you don't have good outcomes or your neighbor didn't have a good outcome or a good experience, you're not going to go there. But we can't ignore what happens before they're a patient and after they're a patient, to the exclusion of just the patient experience.
So let's pivot. I really like that kind of talk track and thought around, patient to consumer. But as we think about digital health overall, and you kind of touched on some of the areas of healthcare you're involved with, especially the research, kind of comparing the disruptors and those, kind of progressive health systems. But talk to me a little bit about digital health and how you define digital health, what it means to you and the work that you do.
Sure. I think that where we need to be is a seamless integration between digital and physical. So you may have heard this term phygital. And Jennifer told this very funny story when she first began this consumer strategy group. She wanted to use the term phygital to explain sort of this idea, this notion that they need to be seamlessly integrated. And her CEO then said, you can't use that word. That's too weird. It sounds like a condition we need to treat. But since then, he has begun to adopt it and even utilizes that. But it's this idea that they intersect in a seamless way, allowing the consumer to toggle between the way that they interact with you in a seamless way. And if you think about other industries, think about retail or financial services, they're not thinking about e-commerce anymore. They're not thinking about e-banking. They've already implemented those. They've optimized those. They've checked them off the strategic plan. But we're still thinking about how do we do that in an integrated, seamless way?
Yeah, it's true. So that's a good kind of segue into the next question. What are a couple areas where you've seen some progress? I think that's a good example, being able to check in or schedule an appointment. We've got a long way to go, but I'm sure there's other areas that you can touch on as well. Maybe, I guess we'll start with a couple where you've seen progress in that space.
I think at a higher level, this whole acknowledgement that digital is here to stay, I think is really important. And I believe that there is increasingly a knowledge that it needs to be easy, which we haven't, in healthcare, we haven't always embraced that, and this whole idea that we really need to focus on the user experience. And while user experience is not a new concept outside of healthcare, I mean, it's been around since the Apple PC wars, right?
Yeah.
But we are just now embracing this idea that it's got to be easy for the consumer. However, I also see more of an acknowledgement too that it also has to be easy for the caregiver and the physician. And so acknowledging that this experience has to be not only integrated, but easy to use and intuitive. And so I think that is changing, and I'm seeing more of our clients embracing UX research and looking at what are those friction points and trying to solve for those and address that. So I think that's one. I think that there's another sort of higher trend that I'm seeing, which is this embracing of the idea that consumers have choices. Patients don't necessarily have choices. I mean, they do, but once they're in your system, more than likely they're going to stay and get their care there. There are exceptions for sure. But consumers have choices. And so the entirety of the journey is as important as what happens. And so recognizing that if the notion of a consumer is that you do have choice, I've got to make sure that I'm the better choice. And particularly as we're seeing more disruptors and then this retail health behemoths coming into play.
I really like what you said. That's a good point. I wanted to kind of amplify it's not just ease of use from a consumer's perspective, but also the providers as well. And, obviously we talk about at length the Great Resignation and physician burnout, which is a reality as we all know, but I think we would all agree it goes beyond just physicians. It's almost healthcare professionals. So talk to me a little bit about, are there any specific examples you can think of on the provider side or healthcare professional side where we could make their lives a little easier to, in turn, deliver care in a more simplified way?
I think that there is, going back to your comment about the Great Resignation and all of the staffing shortages, I think that there is an acknowledgement that we have got to rethink what we're asking of them and rethink the way that they're structuring their jobs. And I was in a conversation yesterday. I was with some of the senior leaders here at Shishmid, and we were brainstorming around some solutions around this topic. And there was a really interesting idea that was put forth, almost like an Uber type concept, where you have a platform where caregivers, probably more nurses and non-physicians, I would imagine, but who knows? We'll never know. But a pool where they could go sign up for this piece of technology, and then health systems could go in and identify what needs they have from a scheduling standpoint and then slot those in, sort of taking out some of the middleman, if you will, which has caused sort of these rising costs in nursing staffing because of traveling nurses, et cetera, but almost creating sort of a platform where you're facilitating the ability for nurses to have more control over their own schedules while still providing a solution for the healthcare systems.
Interesting.
Somebody needs to solve for that, but it's a really interesting idea that brings technology into an everyday solution.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's almost like, that made me think about just like you were saying, making life easier for providers, but also almost creating like an on-demand opportunity for them to schedule as needed. Very cool. That's really interesting. So what about some areas where you still see there's a lot of challenges? What are one or two areas that you've touched on a few, but any others that stick out to you where we still have opportunities?
Going back to this healthcare experience study, one of the advantages that disruptors had was the fact that the voice of the consumer or the consumer was really in their DNA. Mm-hmm. Again, they started with a story, a problem that they needed to solve for. And I think that that's very challenging to figure out. How do you integrate that into the DNA of a health system? Mm-hmm. You think about an IT solution that is being implemented within the system. Well, how many times have we heard stories about the fact that, no one has checked with the consumer, no one has checked with the patient, no one has done any UX testing, but the project is too far down the road. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so there's no peeling back the onion, or it's just not part of the DNA of the organization. And some of the more progressive systems and disruptors that I talked to, it was almost part of their pro forma. There was one system that I talked to, and he was even talking about big initiatives like erecting buildings and hospitals, that co-design was integral to what they do. They were bringing patients and consumers and non-customers into rooms with their employees, with the architects, to really design this building together, even down to like lighting and colors and pathways, but really making sure that it was so integrated. And if something was elevated to a senior leader request to implement a new service or physical property, and there was no consumer insights, it was sent back to get those. So, thinking about how do we do that? Yeah. And how do we implement that idea that voice of the consumer has to be at the forefront? Mm-hmm. It's not the only voice. I'm not suggesting that, but it has to be integrated. Yeah,
it has to lead with it too, from a design perspective. Very cool. Well, I've really enjoyed today's conversation, Sondra. And before we wrap up, just a reminder to our listeners to please go check out all the on-demand content at Shishmid. Go to shishmid.org. Before we leave, I'm sure our listeners would love to connect with you. What's the best way they can connect with you?
Sure. LinkedIn is always great. On LinkedIn. Email is great too. It's a long acronym, but sbrown@mdrginc.com. So either one is great. And if all fails, leave an SOS in our website form.
Excellent. All right. They'll find you. Well, thanks again, Sondra, so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks again for tuning in. If you like what you heard, please share, rate, and review on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting platform. For more content about simplifying healthcare, visit deliverhealth.com/resources, where you'll find our blog, videos, and much more. We'll see you next time on Healthcare Simplified.